Keep those hands high! Do it! Back up! Do not! Hey, do not! Get out! Vehicle taking off southbound. Red Chevy Cruze, occupied 1. Stand by, starting pursuit.
The air in Maumee, Ohio, was thick with a tension that usually precedes a storm, but for Sloane Kessler, the storm had already arrived. She stood in the parking lot of the Red Roof Inn, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold her phone. 2 years of searching, 2 years of sleepless nights, and 2 years of staring at Arlo's empty bedroom had led her to this exact moment. She finally dialed the 3 numbers that felt like a lifeline and a death sentence all at once. When the dispatcher answered, Sloane's voice was a jagged mess of sobs and high-pitched terror. "I need an officer at the Red Roof Inn," she gasped, her eyes locked on a car where she was certain her son was being kept. The dispatcher tried to ask for details, but Sloane's mind was racing too fast for simple answers. She explained that her son had been missing for 2 years and she had finally found where he was being hidden. In the background, the sounds of a heated argument began to bleed into the call. Sloane's husband, Dave, was yelling, trying to confront the people in the other car, while Sloane screamed at him to get back. "They've had him for 2 years." Sloane cried into the phone, her voice breaking with the weight of that massive span of time. She told the dispatcher that the people she was confronting were armed with knives, and the fear that they might vanish again turned her desperation into a frantic panic. Every second the police took to arrive felt like another year slipping through her fingers. She wasn't just reporting a crime, she was pleading for the end of a nightmare that had lasted 730 days. The chaos on the other end of the line was so intense that the dispatchers could hear the raw, unfiltered agony of a mother who refused to let her child disappear one more time. As Sloane continued to shout directions and warnings, the distant wail of sirens began to cut through the noise, signaling that the silence of the last 2 years was finally over. The panic in the Red Roof Inn parking lot shifted from a loud 911 call to a physical standoff. Sloane Kessler didn't just wait for the police to arrive, she took action to make sure her son, Arlo, couldn't be taken away again. She drove her car directly behind the suspect's vehicle, blocking them in so they were trapped in their parking spot. The screech of tires and the sudden stop signaled to everyone involved that Sloane was not letting go this time. Martina, the woman in the other car, began to shout and honk her horn, claiming that Sloane was the one causing trouble. Martina even called the police herself, complaining that a crazy lady was blocking her from leaving with her own child. But Sloane stood her ground, ignoring the insults and the threats. Her husband, Dave, jumped out of their car, his face red with anger as he tried to get a look at the people holding his stepson. Sloane had to scream at him to stay back, fearing that a fight would give the suspects a reason to hurt Arlo or find a way to escape. Every time the suspect's car engine revved, Sloane's heart hammered against her ribs. She was terrified that they would simply ram her car out of the way and disappear back into the shadows of the last 2 years. The standoff felt like it lasted for hours, even though it was only minutes. The suspects sat inside their car, hidden behind glass, while Sloane watched them like a hawk. She knew that if she moved her car even an inch, the chance to save Arlo might be lost forever. When the first blue and red police lights finally reflected in her rearview mirror, Sloane didn't feel relief yet, she only felt a grim determination to make sure the officers understood exactly who the real victims were in this parking lot. The police officers on the scene were met with 2 very different stories. On one side was Sloane, who was crying and pointing at her son. On the other side was Martina, who acted like she was the victim of a big misunderstanding. Martina stood by her car and spoke to the officers with a calm, almost bored voice. She told them that Arlo was not a prisoner at all. She claimed that he was her ex-boyfriend and that they were still just very close friends. Martina explained that Arlo had been staying with her and her group of male friends willingly for the last 2 years. She told the police that Arlo was free to go whenever he wanted, but he simply chose to stay with them. According to her, the only reason there was any trouble today was that Arlo's family had shown up and started a fight. She even tried to make the police feel sorry for her, saying that Sloane's husband had threatened her and her husband. To make her story sound even more real, Martina told the officers that Arlo's family knew where he was the whole time. She claimed that Arlo had even sent voice messages to his grandmother to let her know he was okay. She acted like Sloane was an overprotective mother who couldn't accept that her adult son wanted to live his own life. Martina was so good at lying that the officers weren't sure who to believe at first. While Sloane was filled with raw emotion, Martina used her words like a shield, trying to convince everyone that the last 2 years were just a normal part of Arlo's life and not a kidnapping at all. As the officers listened to Martina's smooth talk, Sloane knew she had to speak up before they believed the lies. She pulled one of the officers aside, her voice lower now but filled with a different kind of intensity. She began to explain that Arlo was not like other young men his age. He was on the autism spectrum, which meant he saw the world differently and was often much too trusting. Sloane described how Arlo's condition made him a target for people who wanted to take advantage of him. She explained that he struggled to understand when someone was being mean or manipulative. To Arlo, these people might have seemed like friends at first because they gave him attention, but Sloane knew that his kindness was being used against him like a weapon. She told the officer that Arlo didn't have the mental strength to fight back or even realize he was being kept in a dangerous situation. "He's very easy to manipulate," Sloane pleaded, her eyes searching the officer's face for any sign of understanding. She wanted them to see that Arlo wasn't staying with Martina because he wanted to, but because he had been tricked into thinking he had no other choice. Sloane's words painted a picture of a young man who was trapped not just by walls, but by his own gentle nature. By explaining Arlo's vulnerability, Sloane shifted the focus from a simple argument to a much more serious case of someone being used and controlled because they couldn't protect themselves. The police decided to take a closer look at Arlo as he sat near the trash can at the Speedway gas station. Sloane watched with a breaking heart as the officers gently asked her son to turn around so they could see him better. Up close, the damage of the last 2 years was impossible to hide. Arlo had a deep, angry cut on the back of his head that looked fresh and painful. His face was swollen, and there was a dark bruise spreading across his cheek, making him look tired and worn down. The officers asked Arlo to lift his shirt, and the sight made everyone go quiet for a second. His torso was covered in a map of purple, blue, and yellow bruises. Some looked like they had happened days ago, while others were a dark, fresh black that showed the violence was still happening. There were marks on his arms and legs that looked like he had been grabbed or held down with great force. Arlo moved slowly, as if his whole body was stiff from pain. He didn't say much at first, but the marks on his skin told a story that Sloane had feared was true. These weren't just accidental bumps or scrapes from playing around. They were the clear, physical proof that her son had been treated like a punching bag. Seeing the clues for the first time made the police realize that Sloane wasn't just an upset mother, she was a mother who had just found her son in the middle of a nightmare. The evidence was right there in front of them, written in bruises all over Arlo's body. Martina realized the police were noticing the marks on Arlo's body, so she quickly came up with a new story. She told the officers that the bruises were just from roughhousing. She said that Arlo and the other men in the group liked to wrestle around like boys do, and sometimes they just got a little too carried away. Martina smiled and acted like it was all just a normal part of their friendship. When the officers asked about the deep cut on the back of Arlo's head, Martina didn't hesitate with her third explanation. She told them that they had all gone to a local park called 12 Creek Park a few days earlier. She claimed that her pet husky had gotten loose and started to run away. According to her, Arlo had chased after the dog and tripped, smacking his head hard against the ground. Martina spoke with a lot of confidence, trying to make the injuries sound like simple accidents. She acted like she was caring for Arlo and that his mother was just making a big deal out of nothing. She even said that Arlo was happy and had been laughing with them right before his family showed up. By telling these stories, Martina hoped to create enough doubt so the police would leave them alone. She wanted the officers to believe that Arlo was safe and that his bruises were just proof of a busy, active life instead of a sign of something much darker. Chapter 7. While Martina continued to give her excuses to the officers, one policeman decided it was time to get the truth directly from the source. He stepped away from the loud arguments and walked over to where Arlo was sitting. The officer leaned down, looked Arlo in the eyes, and asked him a very simple but important question. He asked Arlo if he actually wanted to be with Martina and the other men. Arlo looked at the officer, then toward the car where his mother was waiting, and finally toward Martina. The fear that had kept him quiet for 2 years finally broke. In a clear, small voice, Arlo answered, "No." The officer then asked if the group had been holding him against his will. Arlo didn't hesitate this time, he looked at the officer and said, "Yes." This was the breaking point the police needed. Up until that second, Martina had made it sound like a family fight, but now Arlo had officially told the law that he was a prisoner. The officer realized that the bruises on Arlo's body weren't from playing around, they were signs of a crime. Arlo's simple yes changed everything. It ended the confusion and proved that Sloane was right all along. The nightmare was no longer a secret, and the police finally knew that they weren't just looking at a missing person, they were looking at a rescue. With Arlo safe, the police turned their attention to the people in the car. They wanted to understand the strange group that had kept him for 2 years. Martina Jones, who also used the name Martina Escada, was at the center of it all. The officers soon discovered that the relationships between the people in the motel room were very confusing. Martina was legally married to Michael Escada, who was sitting in the front seat. However, another man in the back seat, Chance Johnston, also claimed on social media that Martina was his wife. The police learned that this was a polyweb, which is a group of many people who are all in a relationship together. There were 4 men and only 1 woman, Martina, all living in a single motel room. Arlo told the police that Martina was the one in charge of everything. She controlled who he talked to and what he did. Even though Martina said they were all just friends, the police began to see that she used these relationships to keep power over the men in the group. As the officers looked into their history, they found that this wasn't just a group of friends living together. It was a violent group that used manipulation to keep people from leaving. Arlo was caught in the middle of their drama and their strange rules. The more the police dug into their social media and their pasts, the more they realized that Martina had built a web of lies to keep everyone under her thumb. This family was not a happy one, it was a trap that Arlo had been stuck in for 2 long years. The investigation was moving fast, but the police needed more than just words to prove a crime had happened. They needed to see where Arlo had been living for the last few months. An officer approached Martina and asked if he could look inside her room at the Red Roof Inn. At first, Martina acted like she had nothing to hide, but then she started making excuses. She told the officer that her dogs were inside and might get upset if strangers walked in. "I have 4 dogs in there," Martina said, trying to make the officer stay outside. She even mentioned that there were 5 adults living in that single room with 2 small beds. The officer didn't back down. He explained that if Arlo was telling the truth about being kidnapped, the police had to check the room for evidence. Martina looked nervous and asked exactly what they were looking for. The officer mentioned that they were looking for anything that could be used to hold someone against their will, like a chair with duct tape. Martina laughed it off, saying she didn't even own a chair like that. She tried to act like the room was just a normal, messy home. However, the police could tell she was stalling. They knew that in cases like this, the most important clues are often hidden behind closed doors. Eventually, Martina realized she couldn't say no forever. She gave the officers permission to enter, but she warned them again about the dogs and the mess. As the officer reached for the door handle, he had no idea that the mess Martina described was actually a scene of total horror. The officer pushed the door open, and the smell hit him like a physical wall. It was a gagging stench of old urine, rotting food, and unwashed bodies that made his eyes water instantly. Martina had called it a mess, but the room looked more like a trash dump than a place for people to live. 5 adults and 4 dogs had been packed into this tiny space for months, and the floor was almost completely hidden under piles of garbage and dirty clothes. As the police stepped inside, they had to be careful where they walked to avoid stepping on animal waste or leftover scraps of food. The air was thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe without coughing. There were only 2 small beds, which meant most of the people in the room had to sleep on the filthy carpet. It was a scene of total neglect that showed just how little Martina and her group cared about basic health or comfort. Sloane watched from a distance, her heart sinking as she realized this was where Arlo had spent his days and nights. The room didn't feel like a home, it felt like a cage designed to break a person's spirit. The officers had to spray the bottom of their shoes afterward because the filth was so thick. Finding the room in this condition proved that Arlo wasn't just staying with friends, he was being kept in a tomb of garbage and rot. The discovery made the investigation much more serious, as the police finally saw the true horror of the world Arlo had been trapped in for 2 long years. The discovery of the room was bad, but the things Arlo began to tell the police were even worse. Once he felt safe away from Martina, Arlo explained that the bruises on his body came from a metal baseball bat. He told the officers that the men in the room would use the bat to hit him whenever they were angry or wanted to control him. It wasn't just a one-time thing, it was a regular part of his life for the last 2 years. Arlo described a terrifying routine where the men would hold his legs open and strike him with the bat. He said his body was often black and blue from the waist down because of these attacks. The police listened in shock as Arlo talked about being restrained and forced to stay in painful positions for a long time. He wasn't allowed to move or sit down when they were punishing him. Sometimes, he was forced to stand for hours until his legs felt like they would give out. The most heartbreaking part was how Arlo spoke about it. Because of his autism, he didn't always understand why they were hurting him, but he knew he was terrified every single day. He explained that he only slept for about 10 hours over a whole week because he was too scared to close his eyes. Sloane cried as she heard about the metal bat and the constant fear her son had lived in. The roughhousing story Martina told was a complete lie. This was a story of a young man who had been treated with terrible cruelty, and the metal bat was the main tool the group used to keep him trapped in his nightmare. The horror of Arlo's life in that room grew even worse as he described how he was fed. He told the officers that he was only allowed to eat one meal every day. Even though there were 5 other adults in the room who ate regularly, Arlo was forced to wait and watch until they decided to give him a small amount of food. He was often so hungry that he felt dizzy, but he was too afraid to ask for more. It wasn't just the food that was controlled, but also what he had to drink. Arlo explained that his water was limited, too, making the hot, smelly room feel even more like a cage. He was kept in a state of constant hunger and thirst to make him weak and easier to manage. This systematic regime of starvation was designed to break his spirit and keep him from having the energy to try and escape or call for help. The police realized that this was a form of torture that left scars they couldn't see on the outside. Arlo had lost weight and looked pale, which was a clear sign that he hadn't been cared for at all. Sloane cried as she heard these details, imagining her son sitting in that dark, stinking room, waiting for his one small meal while his captors ate in front of him. The investigation was no longer just about the beatings with the metal bat, it was about a group of people who had tried to starve the life out of a young man who couldn't protect himself. The local police in Toledo heard the terrible stories Arlo told and decided they had seen enough evidence to act. They knew that this wasn't just a simple argument anymore, it was a serious case of kidnapping and violent assault. Detectives worked quickly to write up official arrest warrants for everyone involved in the group, including Martina, her husband Michael, and the other men who lived in that smelly motel room. A manhunt began as officers across the area were told to look for the group's silver Kia SUV. The police knew these people were dangerous and might try to run away now that Arlo was safe with his mother. They shared the license plate number with every patrol car in the city, waiting for the suspects to make a move. Sloane waited by the phone, hoping the people who hurt her son wouldn't just disappear into the night. The tension grew as the sun went down. The police were on high alert, knowing that the group often moved around at night to stay hidden. Finally, an officer spotted the Kia SUV driving through the dark streets of Maumee. He called for backup immediately, and several police cars began to follow the vehicle from a distance, preparing to stop them. The hunt was almost over, and the law was finally catching up to the family that had caused so much pain. The night air was cold as police cars silently surrounded the silver Kia SUV on a dark road in Maumee. The flashing blue and red lights cut through the darkness, signaling that the chase was finally over. Officers jumped out of their cars with their gear ready, shouting loud and clear commands. "Driver, shut the car off," one officer yelled. "Open your door and step out with your hands up." Michael Escada, Martina's husband, was the first one to step out of the vehicle. He looked tired and pale in the bright police lights. As officers grabbed his hands to put on the handcuffs, he didn't try to fight. Instead, he started making excuses right away. He told the officers that he only did what Martina told him to do. He claimed that Martina had total control over him and that his own mental health problems made it impossible for him to say no when she ordered him to hurt Arlo. Next, the police ordered the other passengers out. Chance Johnston and a younger man named Austin Bradshaw were pulled from the car and placed in handcuffs. The officers searched the SUV, but the metal baseball bat Arlo had described was nowhere to be found. The car smelled almost as bad as the motel room, filled with trash and old food. Even though they didn't find the bat, the police knew they had the right people. This high-tension stop was the moment the family finally fell apart. The men who had spent 2 years hurting a vulnerable young man were now the ones behind bars, facing a long night of questioning by the detectives. Once Arlo was safely in the hospital, doctors performed several scans to see the damage that wasn't visible on the outside. Sloane waited by his bedside, hoping for the best, but the medical reports were much worse than anyone had first thought. The doctors found that the group had done a lot more than just leave bruises, they had actually broken his body. The scans revealed that Arlo had a fractured leg and a fractured hand. These weren't new injuries, but ones he had been forced to live with while being trapped in that room. Even more shocking was the discovery of multiple broken ribs. The doctors explained that these injuries matched Arlo's story about being beaten with a metal bat and being kicked by the men in the group. Seeing the medical evidence in black and white made the situation feel even more heavy. It proved that Arlo had been living in constant, physical agony while Martina and the others lied to the police about roughhousing. Every time Arlo had been forced to stand for hours or move around that filthy room, he was doing it with broken bones. For Sloane, this was the most painful part of the journey, realizing that while she was searching for him, her son was enduring a level of pain that no one should ever have to face. The true extent of the violence was finally clear, and it was a miracle that Arlo had survived it all. The long road to justice finally came to an end in a quiet courtroom. One by one, the men who had hurt Arlo were forced to face a judge. Michael Escada, Martina's legal husband, was sentenced to at least 16 years in prison for kidnapping and assault. He tried to blame Martina for everything, but the judge decided he was still responsible for his own actions. Chance Johnston, the man who called Martina his wife on Facebook, received a total of 8 years for his role in the crime. Other members of the group also faced the consequences. Austin Bradshaw was sentenced to 8 years, and even Aaron Bradshaw was sent to prison for 3 years for his connection to the violence. David Cessna, the man who officers said looked like Charles Manson, also pled guilty and waited for his turn to be sentenced. The group that had once felt so powerful while hiding in a dark motel room was now scattered across different prison cells. Martina Jones, the woman who had started the whole web of lies, faced the most charges, including kidnapping and tampering with evidence. She told the court she was not guilty by reason of insanity, and she had to wait for a trial to decide her fate. While the lawyers talked and the judges made their rulings, Arlo was far away from the gagging stench and the metal bats. With Sloane by his side, he began the slow process of healing. The 2 years of darkness were over, and for the first time in a long time, Arlo and his mother could look forward to a future filled with safety and love instead of fear.